How has your nosy neighbor actually saved your life? I was having the worst Monday of my life when I accidentally locked myself out of my own house. My phone was dead inside on the kitchen counter, and my keys were sitting right next to it, mocking me through the window. After trying every window and the back door, I realized I had to break in through the bathroom window that I knew had a broken lock. My neighbor Karen had been watching me from her kitchen window the whole time. She was the type who kept binoculars by her front door and wrote down every license plate that drove through our cul-de-sac. She'd lived there for 30 years and acted like she owned the entire street. Everyone had a Karen story about her calling the cops on kids selling lemonade or reporting people for having their trash cans out too early. I grabbed a ladder from my garage and propped it against the side of my house. The bathroom window was small, but I figured I could squeeze through if I removed the screen first. Karen was now standing on her front porch with her arms crossed, watching me like I was committing the crime of the century. I waved at her, trying to look friendly, but she just glared back. The screen came off easier than expected, and I managed to push the window open. I was halfway through when I heard my pants rip on the window frame. Great. Now I'd have to explain to my wife why I destroyed my work pants breaking into our own house. I wiggled through and landed hard on the bathroom floor, knocking over a basket of towels. I went straight to the kitchen to grab my keys and phone. My phone had 17 missed calls from my boss because I was already an hour late to an important meeting. I was typing out an apology text when I heard sirens getting closer. Through the front window, I could see 2 police cars pulling into my driveway with their lights flashing. My stomach dropped as I realized what was happening. Karen had actually called the cops on me for breaking into my own house. I grabbed my wallet to get my ID ready and walked outside with my hands visible. The officers were already out of their cars with their hands resting on their weapons. Karen was speed-walking across her lawn in her house slippers. Before I could say anything, Karen started pointing at me and yelling to the officers. She was talking so fast spit was flying out of her mouth. She kept saying she'd witnessed me breaking and entering in broad daylight. She described in detail how I'd been casing the house and used tools to break in through a window. The officers looked between us trying to figure out what was going on. I tried to explain that this was my house, and I'd just locked myself out. I showed them my driver's license with my address clearly printed on it. I even offered to show them family photos inside and mail with my name on it. One of the officers seemed to understand, but Karen wasn't having it. She kept interrupting and insisting something wasn't right. The situation was getting more ridiculous by the second. More neighbors were coming outside to watch the show. Mr. Peterson from across the street was recording everything on his phone. The teenage kids next door were laughing and pointing. I felt like I was in some bizarre comedy sketch, except it was really happening, and my boss was probably firing me via email at that very moment. Karen pulled one of the officers aside and started whispering urgently. She kept glancing at me and shaking her head. The officer looked uncomfortable but had to listen to her concerns. The other officer asked me to wait by my front door while they sorted everything out. I stood there in my ripped pants. After what felt like forever, the officers walked back over. The one who'd been talking to Karen looked embarrassed. He apologized for the confusion and said they had to respond to all calls, but everything seemed to be in order. He asked if I wanted to file a complaint against Karen for a false report. Before I could answer, Karen pushed past the officers. She stood right in front of me with her face red and her gray hair sticking up in all directions. Her eyes were narrow and full of anger. She looked me up and down like I was something gross she'd found on her shoe. The officers tried to guide her away, but she planted her feet and pointed her finger right at my chest. "I don't care what those papers say," she hissed. "I know what I saw and I know what you are." One of the officers stepped between us and told Karen she needed to go back to her property. She backed up but kept her eyes locked on mine. The hate in them made me take a step back. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding anymore. This was something deeper and uglier. Karen looked at the officers and then back at me. Her next words came out dripping with venom that made everyone freeze. "You people can't afford to live here. Go on, boy. Tell them what you did last Saturday." My eyes went wide as she looked the police and started talking. She pointed at me and told them she saw me Saturday night around 10:30, sneaking between houses and taking packages off porches. My stomach dropped hard as I realized she was trying to frame me for actual crimes. The officers looked at each other and I could see them shifting into a different mode. Karen kept going and said she watched me for at least 20 minutes going from the house to the house with a bag. She was lying through her teeth, but the officers had to take it seriously now. Officer Saunders stepped forward and asked Karen to describe exactly what she saw and where. She started talking fast about how she was watching TV when she noticed movement outside. She said she grabbed her binoculars and watched me creeping around in dark clothes. The problem was she couldn't describe what I was supposedly wearing, beyond saying it was dark. She kept changing details about whether I had a hood or a hat or nothing on my head. Officer Stratton pulled out a notebook and started writing while Karen talked. The other officer asked her why she didn't call the police. Saturday night, if she saw someone stealing. Karen's face got red, and she said she wasn't completely sure until she saw me breaking into this house today. That didn't make any sense, and everyone could tell. My hands were shaking with anger as I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Saturday's photos. I had dozens of pictures from my brother's birthday party that started at 6 and went past midnight. The first photo showed me and my brother at the restaurant with a timestamp of 6:47 p.m. I showed Officer Saunders photo after photo with clear timestamps showing I was 2 hours away. There were group shots, food pictures, and even a video of us singing Happy Birthday at 9:15. Karen leaned in to look and immediately said the timestamps must be fake. She insisted anyone could change those on a phone. I opened my Uber app and showed the receipt from Saturday night. The pickup was at 12:23 a.m. from my brother's address, and the drop-off was at my house at 1:47 a.m. The officer looked at the receipt carefully and nodded. Officer Saunders turned to Karen and asked if she'd filed any reports about the package thefts before today. She admitted she hadn't, but claimed she'd been monitoring the situation for weeks. She said she kept a notebook with all the suspicious activity she'd seen. Officer Stratton quietly walked over to Mr. Peterson, who was still recording, and asked if he had any doorbell camera footage from Saturday night. Peterson nodded and said he'd been meaning to check it after hearing about missing packages. Right then, my phone started ringing, and my boss's name appeared on the screen. I had to answer, even though this was the worst possible time. I told him I was dealing with a police situation at my house, involving false accusations from a neighbor. He went quiet for several seconds before saying we needed to have a serious conversation about my reliability. He said missing the client meeting was unacceptable regardless of the circumstances. He told me to be in his office first thing tomorrow morning and hung up. My career was taking real hits because of Karen's lies. Officer Saunders asked to see my driver's license again, and then asked if I could show him my bank statement from Saturday. I opened my banking app and showed him the transactions from that day. There was a charge at the restaurant near my brother's place at 8:17 p.m. for dinner. Another charge showed up at 10:45 p.m. at a bar down the street from the restaurant. Officer Saunders showed the phone screen to his partner, who nodded and made more notes. They were building a clear picture that I wasn't anywhere near the neighborhood when Karen claimed to see me. Mr. Peterson walked over holding his phone up and said he had something we needed to see. He'd pulled up his doorbell camera footage from Saturday night around 10:30. The video showed someone in a dark hoodie walking up driveways, but the person was clearly shorter than me. They were wearing white sneakers that I don't own and had a different way of walking. Karen's face turned bright red as she watched the footage. The person in the video was obviously not me, but she kept insisting it must be an accomplice or something. Peterson swiped to another video from 11:15 that showed the same person going to another house. Officer Saunders took Peterson's phone and watched both videos carefully. He asked Peterson to email him the footage and gave him a business card. Then he pulled out another card and handed it to me with an incident number written on the back. He said loud enough for all the neighbors to hear that I'd been cleared of any wrongdoing. He suggested I might want to file a report about the false accusations if they continued. Karen's face twisted up, and she stormed back toward her house muttering about how this wasn't over. The other neighbors started going back inside, but I could see them typing on their phones. I knew they were probably posting about this on the neighborhood Facebook group. I pulled up the group on my phone, and sure enough, Karen had already posted about suspicious activity. She'd uploaded a blurry photo of me from this morning, trying to get through my bathroom window. The post said she'd witnessed a break-in and called the police, but they refused to do anything. Comments were already piling up with some people asking questions and others defending me. Mark from 2 streets over said he'd had packages stolen too, and wanted to know more. Jennifer from the next block said she'd seen me around, and I seemed nice. The whole neighborhood was debating my character, based on Karen's lies. My reputation was being torn apart by people who barely knew me. I needed to call my wife and explain everything before she heard it from someone else. She answered on the first ring, and I told her about Karen's racist accusations and the false theft claims. My wife got quiet, and then her voice got hard as she said she was leaving work early. She told me to document everything, including the officers' names and badge numbers. She said we needed to screenshot Karen's Facebook post and save all the evidence from Saturday. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the anger underneath when she said Karen had messed with the wrong family. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed with a call from a number I didn't recognize. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Cita Cisneros from the Community Mediation Service and said Officer Saunders had given her my contact info. She explained they offer free sessions to help neighbors work through disputes before things get worse. Her voice stayed calm and professional as she described how both parties would sit down with her to create boundaries and agreements. She said the process was voluntary, but could really help prevent future problems. I wrote down her number and said I'd think about it, but honestly I was too angry to imagine sitting across from Karen right now. My phone dinged with an email from Mr. Peterson containing several video files from his doorbell camera. He'd gone through the past week of recordings and found Saturday night's footage showing someone in a dark hoodie walking up driveways around 10:30. The person was clearly shorter than me and wearing white sneakers I don't own. Peterson wrote that he was happy to share this with anyone who questioned what really happened. Having someone in my corner made my chest feel less tight. I forwarded the videos to my wife and saved them in a new folder on my computer labeled Evidence. Officer Saunders called an hour later to tell me they'd received 3 separate package theft reports from Saturday night. He said they had a suspect on camera from multiple houses, and the person didn't match my description at all. The thief was younger with a different build and wore that same dark hoodie from Peterson's video. He said Karen's claims were completely unfounded, and he'd make sure that was documented. I thanked him and hung up, feeling like maybe things were turning around. My wife got home and immediately started helping me organize everything. We printed out my Saturday receipts from dinner and drinks at my brother's party. She created a timeline showing exactly where I was every hour that night. We added screenshots from my social media, showing me in photos at the party with timestamps. My brother texted me a written statement, confirming I was at his place until after midnight. We put everything in a manila folder with tabs and labels for the HOA meeting. Working on this together made me feel less alone in this mess. The next morning at work, a coworker pulled me aside in the break room. She said everyone was talking about my arrest and asking if I was in trouble. Apparently someone's spouse had seen the police cars at my house, and the rumor mill went crazy. She told me she'd been setting people straight and vouching for me, but the damage was spreading. I spent my lunch break writing an email to my team explaining the false accusation situation without going into too much detail. Another neighbor knocked on my door that evening with more doorbell footage. She showed me a clear video of the actual thief from Saturday night wearing a hoodie I definitely don't own. The person was obviously younger and had a completely different walk than me. She said she'd already sent it to the police and would share it with anyone else who needed to see it. More neighbors were starting to see through Karen's lies. 2 days later, I was taking out the trash when I saw Karen getting her mail. She looked right at me with pure hate in her eyes, then went inside and slammed her door so hard the wreath fell off. I pulled out my notebook and wrote down the date, time, and what happened just like Sita had suggested when she called back. Every interaction needed documentation now, even if nothing was said. My wife ordered security cameras online that night, and we spent the weekend installing them around our property. We put one facing the front door, another watching the driveway, and 2 more covering the sides of the house. We also upgraded our door locks to smart locks that record when they're opened. We sat down and created a safety plan, including emergency contacts and what to do if Karen escalated. We agreed to document any weird behavior from any neighbor and keep everything in a shared folder on our phones. The HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday night at the community center. I walked in carrying my folder of evidence with my wife beside me. The room was already half full, and people were whispering when they saw us. Karen sat in the front row with her arms crossed. Kenny Howell called the meeting to order and said we needed to address some recent security concerns. Before he could continue, Karen stood up and started talking about the break-in she witnessed. I raised my hand and Kenny nodded for me to speak. I stood up and calmly explained that I'd locked myself out of my own house and showed my driver's license proving I lived there. I pulled out the police report showing I'd been cleared of any wrongdoing. Karen kept trying to interrupt, but Kenny told her to let me finish. I showed the timeline from Saturday with receipts and photos, proving I was at my brother's party. I passed around Peterson's video and the other neighbor's footage, showing the real thief. Officer Saunders had actually shown up, and he stood in the back confirming there was no evidence linking me to any thefts. The room was dead quiet, except for Karen muttering under her breath. Most people were nodding and seemed to believe me, but a few still looked unsure. After the meeting ended, people started leaving in small groups, still talking. Ivy Carney walked over to me near the door, looking embarrassed. She said she was sorry for not speaking up sooner about Karen's behavior. She told me Karen had accused her gardener of stealing last year with no proof. She mentioned another family Karen had called the cops on for having a birthday party. The pattern was clear that Karen had been harassing people for years, and everyone just let it happen because it was easier than confronting her. That same night, I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw Karen had posted something new in our neighborhood group. The photo showed a dark figure near some trash cans with the caption asking if anyone else had seen suspicious activity. I zoomed in, and my stomach dropped when I recognized my own jacket from when I'd taken out the garbage earlier that week. She'd cropped the photo so you couldn't see my house number or the trash bags I was clearly holding. The comments were already piling up with people saying they'd been extra worried about crime lately. I took screenshots of everything, including the original photo's timestamp, which matched exactly when I always put out our bins. My wife looked over my shoulder and shook her head in disgust at how Karen had twisted something so normal into something sinister. The next morning, Sita called to schedule our mediation prep meeting for that afternoon at her office, downtown. I drove there after lunch and found a small building with motivational posters on the walls and a water cooler in the corner. Sita was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and a notepad ready on her desk. She asked me to walk through everything that had happened starting from the lockout incident. I showed her my documentation folder with all the screenshots, timestamps, and witness statements I'd been collecting. She nodded as she took notes and asked specific questions about what outcomes I wanted from mediation. I told her I just wanted Karen to stop harassing me and my family and to stop spreading lies about us online and to the police. She helped me write down 3 main points to focus on during the session instead of getting emotional or bringing up every little thing Karen had done. We practiced how I would respond if Karen got hostile or tried to derail the conversation with new accusations. Sita explained that mediation only worked if both parties participated in good faith, but at least there would be an official record of the attempt. That afternoon, my boss called me into his office and closed the door behind us. He sat down and pulled up some spreadsheets on his computer, showing client assignments for the next quarter. He explained that after the missed meeting and recent disruptions, he was reducing my portfolio by 40% and giving those accounts to other team members. The commission loss would hit our budget hard, but he made it clear this was better than termination. I nodded and thanked him for keeping me on, even though inside I was calculating how we'd cover our mortgage with the reduced income. He said if I could prove reliability for the rest of the quarter, we could revisit the assignments. But for now, this was the new reality. I left his office feeling the weight of what Karen's lies had cost my family financially. The next day, I walked into the police station with my folder of evidence and asked to speak with Officer Saunders about filing a formal harassment complaint. He came out to the lobby and led me to a small interview room where we could talk privately. I spread out all my documentation on the table, including the Facebook posts, the false Saturday accusation, and the pattern of targeting. Officer Saunders pulled out the proper forms and helped me fill out each section with specific dates and incidents. He explained that once filed, Karen would be notified and given a chance to respond, but the complaint would create an official record. He also said they could issue a formal warning about misuse of emergency services based on the false burglary call. I signed the paperwork, and he gave me a case number for my records. 3 days later, Officer Saunders called to tell me they'd delivered the warning to Karen that morning. She'd received written notice that any future false reports could result in fines up to $500 or criminal charges for misusing emergency services. He said she'd been angry, but had signed the acknowledgement form, which was now part of the official record. That evening, I got a Facebook message from someone I'd only seen in passing around the neighborhood. They said they'd been watching the situation unfold and wanted me to know Karen had done similar things to their family when they'd moved in 2 years ago. They described how she'd called the cops on their teenage son for suspicious behavior when he was just walking home from the school. They mentioned another family who'd moved away after Karen made their life miserable with constant complaints and surveillance. The pattern was clear that we weren't her first targets and probably wouldn't be her last. The mediation day arrived, and I met Sita at the community center conference room 30 minutes early to prepare. She'd already arranged the chairs so Karen and I would sit across from each other with her at the head of the table. Karen walked in exactly on time, wearing a flowered blouse and carrying a thick folder of her own papers. She sat down without looking at me and crossed her arms over her chest with her jaw clenched tight. Sita started by explaining the ground rules about letting each person speak without interruption and keeping voices calm and respectful. She said the goal was finding a way for us to coexist peacefully as neighbors without further conflict. Karen immediately started tapping her fingers on the table, but stayed quiet as Sita continued outlining the process. When it was Karen's turn to explain her perspective, she launched into a story about 5 years ago. Her voice cracked slightly as she described coming home from grocery shopping to find her back door kicked in and her jewelry box emptied. She said the police never caught who did it, and she'd been watching the neighborhood ever since to prevent it from happening again. She insisted she was protecting everyone by staying vigilant and reporting anything unusual. She kept saying she knew what criminals looked like and how they operated. Sita thanked her for sharing, and then turned to me for my response. I took a deep breath and kept my voice steady as I explained how her false accusations had nearly cost me my job. I described the 40% pay cut I'd taken and how my family was now struggling financially because of her lies about Saturday. I looked her straight in the eyes and said her comment about "you people" was racist and unacceptable. I told her she needed to stop targeting my family immediately. Karen's face turned red, but Sita raised her hand to prevent her from responding. Yet. Sita pulled out a blank agreement form and started writing down specific terms we could both follow. The first point was that Karen had to contact the HOA before calling police about any neighbor for non-emergency situations. The second was that both parties would avoid direct confrontation and only communicate through written channels if absolutely necessary. The third was that neither party would post about the other on social media or discuss the situation with other neighbors. She read through each point carefully and asked if we both understood what we were agreeing to. I said, yes, immediately, while Karen stared at the paper for a long time before finally nodding. Sita slid the agreement across the table, and Karen grabbed the pen with her knuckles white from gripping it so hard. She scratched her signature on the paper while muttering something about her constitutional rights being trampled. Sita reminded her this was completely voluntary, and she could leave without signing if she wanted. Karen pushed the paper back across the table and stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. She walked out without looking at me and slammed the door behind her hard enough to make the windows rattle. Sita made copies of the signed agreement and handed me one for my records. She said she'd send the original to Officer Saunders to add to the official case file. I thanked her and left the community center feeling like I had some protection, even if Karen never actually apologized. 2 days later, Officer Saunders called to confirm he'd logged the mediation agreement in the police database. He said Karen was now officially cautioned, and any future false reports would result in immediate charges. Having that documentation in the system made me feel safer knowing there was a paper trail if she tried anything else. At work the next morning, my boss called me into his office and closed the door behind us. He handed me a thick folder with a new client project that needed to be completed in 2 weeks. The deadlines were crazy tight, but he said this was my chance to prove I was still reliable after missing that important meeting. I took the folder and spent the next 12 hours at my desk going through every detail and creating a project timeline. My wife and I spent the weekend installing the new smart doorbell system we'd ordered online. We mounted cameras at the front door, back door, and both sides of the house where blind spots used to be. The system connected to our phones, so we'd get alerts anytime someone came near our property. We tested everything multiple times and made sure the night vision worked properly. My wife wrote down all our emergency contacts and posted them on the fridge, including Officer Saunders' direct line. We practiced what to do if Karen showed up at our door again and agreed to always record any interaction with her. Instead of filing charges against Karen, I decided to submit a written statement to the HOA board. Sita had suggested this would show good faith while still creating an official record of what happened. I spent 3 hours writing out every detail from the Monday incident through the mediation session. I attached copies of the police report, the mediation agreement, and screenshots of Karen's Facebook posts. Kenny from the HOA emailed back saying they'd review everything at their next board meeting. 3 weeks into my special project, I had my first HR check-in about the performance improvement plan. I'd met every single deadline and submitted all deliverables early with 0 errors. My boss told HR he was impressed with my dedication and work quality since the incident. The HR manager made notes in my file that I was exceeding expectations and on track to complete the plan successfully. She said if I kept this up for another month, they'd remove me from the plan early. Kenny sent out an email blast to all residents with new neighborhood watch guidelines he'd written. The rules specifically said residents must verify any suspicious activity before calling police. There was a whole section about how racial profiling was prohibited and would result in HOA violations. He required actual evidence like photos or video before making any reports about neighbors. The guidelines mentioned that false reports could lead to fines or loss of HOA privileges. I started noticing Karen actively avoiding me around the neighborhood. When I'd walk to my mailbox and she was getting hers, she'd turn around and go back inside. If we were both in our driveways at the same time, she'd look away and pretend to be busy with something in her car. The tension was still thick between us, but at least she wasn't confronting me or making accusations anymore. One afternoon, Officer Saunders called with amazing news that made me sit down in relief. They'd arrested the actual package thief from that Saturday, some teenager from 2 neighborhoods over. The kid had been caught on multiple doorbell cameras and confessed to all the thefts, including the ones on our street. Officer Saunders emailed me the arrest report showing the dates and locations of every theft the kid admitted to. The report proved beyond any doubt that I had nothing to do with the Saturday crimes Karen accused me of. I forwarded the arrest report to Kenny at the HOA and asked him to share it with the board. Over the next few days, 2 different neighbors knocked on my door to talk privately. They both said they felt bad for believing Karen's story without questioning it. They admitted they should have known better since I'd been a good neighbor for years. I accepted their apologies, but kept the conversation short and didn't invite them inside. Trust takes time to rebuild after people show you how quickly they'll turn on you. The whole experience taught me that some neighbors will believe the worst about you without any proof at all. Officer Saunders called me the next week while I was working from home. He said the police department had started offering bias awareness training for community groups. He suggested maybe the HOA could benefit from a session about avoiding racial profiling. He gave me the contact info for their community outreach coordinator. I forwarded everything to Kenny, who said he'd bring it up at the next board meeting. 2 days later, Sita sent me an email that caught me off guard. She was organizing a panel about resolving neighbor conflicts without escalation. She wanted me to share my experience and talk about how mediation helped. My hands got sweaty just thinking about speaking in front of people. But I typed back yes, because maybe my story could help someone else dealing with this kind of mess. The panel was scheduled for next month at the community center. I started writing notes about what I wanted to say. Meanwhile, work was actually going better than expected. I turned in my special project a week early with 0 errors. My boss called me into his office on Friday afternoon. He had my performance improvement plan paperwork on his desk. He said I'd exceeded every single requirement, and he was removing me from the plan early. My role wasn't fully back to what it was before, but at least I had job security again. He even mentioned possibly adding me to a new client team next quarter. I walked out of his office feeling lighter than I had in weeks. That evening, my wife suggested we take a walk around the neighborhood. We hadn't done that since the whole Karen incident started. We put on our jackets and headed out just as the sun was setting. Mr. Peterson was watering his lawn and waved at us. The young couple 3 houses down smiled and said hello. Even the teenagers next door nodded as they shot hoops in their driveway. The neighborhood felt different now, but we were learning how to exist in it again. We walked past Karen's house and she was nowhere to be seen. Her curtains were closed and her porch light was off. We kept walking and talking about normal things like what to make for dinner. After that walk, I decided to do something proactive. I sent a text to Mr. Peterson asking if he wanted to stay in touch about neighborhood stuff. He replied right away saying that was a great idea. Then I remembered Ivy from the HOA meeting who'd spoken up for me. I found her number in the neighborhood directory and texted her too. Within an hour, we had a little group chat going. We agreed to check in with each other if we saw anything weird happening. Peterson said he'd share any important doorbell camera footage. Ivy said she'd keep us posted on HOA decisions. Having real allies in the neighborhood made everything feel safer. We weren't trying to gang up on anyone, just looking out for each other. The next morning, I found an envelope in my mailbox with no stamp or return address. My stomach tightened as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with Karen's shaky handwriting. She wrote that she would only communicate through the HOA from now on. She said she understood the mediation agreement and would follow it. There was no apology or admission of wrongdoing, but at least she was acknowledging the rules we'd set up. I took a photo of the note and added it to my documentation folder. 3 weeks had passed since that awful Monday when I'd locked myself out. As I sat at my kitchen table paying bills, something hit me. I felt stronger somehow. Not in a cheesy movie way, but in a real practical way. I knew my rights better now. I knew how to document things properly. I knew which neighbors had my back and which ones didn't. I wasn't going to make myself smaller just to make other people comfortable anymore. The whole experience had taught me hard lessons about standing up for myself. My job was stable again, even if my boss still watched me more closely. Our house had new cameras and smart locks, so we'd never get locked out again. The HOA had actual policies against racial profiling now with real consequences. Karen was boxed in by the mediation agreement and HOA rules. She couldn't just call the cops on me anymore without facing fines or worse. The arrest report for the real package thief was public record proving my innocence. My reputation in the neighborhood was mostly restored. Some neighbors still looked at me funny, but most had moved on. Mr. Peterson, Ivy, and a few others had become actual friends through all this. We had each other's backs now. The police department was doing bias training next month for any HOA board members who wanted it. Kenny said at least half the board had signed up already. Small changes, but real ones. Yet, my wife and I could walk our own street without constantly looking over our shoulders. We could get our mail without worrying about confrontations. We could exist in our own neighborhood like we had the right to. It wasn't a perfect ending because there's no such thing. But we'd won this battle and secured our right to live here peacefully. I really appreciate you sticking with me through all the questions and curiosity today. It means a lot to share these moments with you. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.